The only words I have to people in Serbia is think about it. We've got life, and it's a very good thing. And we ought to look around for if anyone gave us this. And I think that leads to the Christian religion.
Greetings from Serbia. My name is Nemanja Jurišić, and welcome to another episode of NT Podcast, Science and Theology, leading channel in the Balkan in the field of blending science and theology. Today we are honored to have a truly special guest, one of the most prominent philosophers of our time, Oxford Professor Ričard Svinburnom. Dr. Svinburn, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me on your podcast.
Thank you also, because I know that your schedule is really busy, and thanks for your time. So for audience, Dr. Swinburne is author of many influential books and papers on the existence of God, and today he will share with us his thoughts and arguments in support of God's existence. So I prepared some questions for Dr. Swinburne, and let us dive into those questions. The first one is, if the universe is eternal, either there is an infinite regress or it goes through a cyclical loop. Does this indicate that the cosmological argument is flawed?
No, it does not, because the cosmological argument is not just an argument to the universe needs starting off, and therefore there must be a God to start it off. It's an argument that the universe at each moment of time needs to be kept in existence by a God. Therefore, if the universe is eternal in the sense of everlasting, there's always been one, it's still the case that at each moment of everlasting time, God keeps it being, keeps it in existence. And if you think, as I am inclined to think, that a cause must to some extent precede its effect, then the way this works is that at every period of the universe's existence, God at a slightly earlier and overlapping period keeps it in existence. And so both theories of God acting and the universe go on backwards forever. So whether the universe had a beginning or not is irrelevant to the cosmological argument.
Right, but would the beginning of the universe, if that happened, would that improve some probability for some being with libertarian free will or something? Would you say that?
I'm inclined to think that maybe it would, but not significantly, because there's the enormous problem, which I think the existence of God solves, is why is there anything physical at all? Why are there so many physical things, all of which behave in exactly the same way, in the sense that every atom in the universe behaves like every other atom, and so on. And this is the really startling thing that needs explanation. But if the universe did have a beginning, yes, of course, it would be a problem as to what started it off. But I also think that it's a problem if it didn't have a beginning, that it should ever have existed. And so the same thing. And if you think that isn't a problem, then I don't see why it should be a problem that it had a start. But it may be that it makes a bit of difference, but it's not the central point of the cosmological argument.
All right, but why would you say that the cause of the universe is God, rather than a zero-dimensional point, some quantum field, singularity, impersonal Brahman, Tao or Tao, the Neoplatonic, the one, or non-spatial temporal universal wave function, etc. There are so many options and simpler explanations for the cause of the universe, whereas God is a more complicated explanation carrying with it many ambiguities and paradoxes. What is your response?
My response is that the existence of God is a very simple starting point, a very simple hypothesis, far simpler than the ones that you have stated. The difference between all of the ones which you stated and the traditional God is that the traditional God is supposed to be a conscious, personal being. My definition of God is that he is an essentially everlasting, omnipotent being. And I think it follows from that that he has all the other divine properties, including perfect goodness. The way this follows is that if God is truly omnipotent, he can do everything, but that wouldn't mean anything unless he knew what he was doing. That is to say, he could know. To be omnipotent, you have to not merely have power, but know that you have the power to bring about anything. And therefore, he would know which actions are good and which actions are bad. And the good moves, that is to say, to recognize something as good entails having some inclination to do it. Of course, we humans have counter inclinations, and we have to choose between satisfying our desires and doing the good. But God, being a very simple being, has no such counter inclinations. And therefore, when he recognizes an action as good, he inevitably is moved to do it. And therefore, as it were, built into God is the follows from the definition that he will produce a good universe. Now, all the other things that you suggested, there's no, they are not conscious beings, and so they are not aware of don't have this concept of goodness, and therefore it has to be built into them, into the singularity or whatever, that it is going to produce a universe of this sort. And that is in itself a rather complicated supposition, because the universe is a very big thing. Let's consider the evidence for primary evidence for God, which I consider as four substantial pieces of evidence. First, that there is a big physical universe. Secondly, that it is governed by relatively simple laws of nature. But what that means is that every atom in the universe has the same power to attract other atoms and the same liability to be attracted by them, and so on. And that is to say, it behaves in the same way as every other atom. And that is an extraordinary supposition, not to be explained by chance. But not merely is that the case, but the laws of nature are such as to lead to the evolution of us. And furthermore, we are conscious beings, which is something not in the least to be explained by the normal physical laws of nature. Okay, but all of these data are necessary for our existence, and therefore, and we are good things, and God can see that we are good things. We are unique centers of power. Very little power, many, and therefore what I call mini creators. We can make little differences to the universe and to ourselves and to each other. And that's a very good thing. And thereby we can form our own characters. By making good choices, we become better people, and conversely. So we're a very good thing. And God has therefore very good reason for producing us. But since these bits of evidence, these data to which I have drawn attention, are necessary for the existence of us, God will bring them about. But there's no reason why any of these alternatives should bring them about unless you build into them the inclination to produce a simple universe of this kind. But why should you build into them that inclination? As it stands, you could have a much simpler built-in. You might say that the singularity is just as likely to produce a few more singularities, and that's it. There has to be a reason why all these particular things should be built into any of the alternative suppositions which you provided. But it follows from the nature of God that he will produce the good, and we are good things, so it's quite probable, not certain, but quite probable he'll produce us. I say not certain because there are endless other good things in the world he might produce and perhaps does, but we certainly can say it's probable that he would produce beings like us because we are unique and we have the great, what makes us different from any other good things is that we have a unique property which God himself does not have. We can choose between good and evil. God cannot. That is a good thing to have a choice between good and evil, a little choice, so we can do a certain amount of evil. And that's what's the sort of power we have. But God does not have that power, and it's a good thing he doesn't, because the sort of evil he could produce if he did would be enormous. So I suggest that, in fact, the hypothesis of theism is the simplest hypothesis, and if you like, I could show why the other divine properties, apart from perfect goodness, also follow from it. Therefore, it is the most probable supposition because a simpler theory is always more probable than a complicated theory because there are always an infinite number of complicated theories which would be compatible with any collection of data, including the ones we have mentioned. But only if simplicity is evidence of truth could there be any science at all, because otherwise all a scientific theory would have to do would be compatible with the existing evidence. And there are an infinite number of ways that it's logically possible the universe might behave tomorrow, and we can always produce a complicated scientific theory which would make that prediction. But unless simplicity is powerful evidence of truth, there could be no science. And so we must go for the simplest explanation of the cause of the universe, and for the reason I have given, God is the simplest explanation.
All right, so Dr. Swinburne, let me jump in quickly. Would you say that if God exists, he would necessarily create us, or would you rather say that it has more sense, but that's not necessarily?
Well, I always try and make modest claims, and therefore probable. But I can see the case for saying that it's inevitable he would, simply because we have this unique property of choosing between good and evil, which no other creature has. And of course, if another creature did have it, then it would in effect be human.
Right, thank you so much. Now, you said that it's simpler explanation, but what about parsimony principle or Occam razor? Because with God we have more problems as divine hiddenness, problem of evil, logical problem of Trinity, if that's Christian God. So we have more problems with concept of God. So that's some would say that that's not simpler explanation. What is your thought?
One or two of the things you have mentioned are pieces of evidence against the existence of God, and I haven't mentioned those, and we could go on to discuss those, and I think one of your questions does give me scope for discussing those, so perhaps we shall postpone that until then. As for the suggestion that there are complications in the hypothesis itself, e.g. the doctrine of the Trinity, well, certainly we can discuss that. I don't think it is a complication. And if you want, I'll talk about that now, or...
Well, can you just briefly say why you think that that's not contradiction?
Oh, well, it depends what you think it is. My view is that the doctrine of the Trinity, I say my view, I think this is the clear view of the Christian fathers, though it's been developed in one or two unsatisfactory ways by different successors. What they said is each of the persons of the Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, have the same divine essence. And that meant they're all omnipotent, omniscient, and so on. But it meant by essence what philosophers call monadic properties. That is to say, a property that something has independent of its relation to any other thing. But there are also relations which these days tend to be counted as properties, but wouldn't have been counted as properties in the fourth century AD. And the members of the Trinity have different relations to each other. That is to say, one of them is uncaused. One of them is caused by the first, and one of them is caused by the first, or by the by the first with the aid of the second, or by the first through the second. Now that is what distinguishes them. Otherwise, they are all divine. And I think it's in fact necessary, not contradictory, necessary that if there is one divine person, there will be three divine persons. For this reason, God is love. A perfectly good being would be perfectly loving. And that love cannot be exercised without someone else to love. Someone independent of oneself. And for that reason, the Father brings about, causes the existence of the second. And Augustine said this. He said, if God, the Father, couldn't cause another one, he would be impotent. If he refused to do so, he would be jealous. So inevitably, the Father will give rise to the Son. But, and Richard of St. Victor in the 11th century was the first person to give the argument which I'm just about to give. If you really love someone, you will want them to be loved by someone else and to love someone else. That's the great benefit of children. When we have children, there's something for our spouse to love as well as for ourselves. And we think that's a good thing, rightly so. And so, inevitably, the love of the Father for the Son will involve having a third divine person who is loved by and loves each of the others. But then, and this is my addition, I think, don't remember finding it in Richard Victor. The question arises, well, why not 15 gods or whatever? And the answer to that is this. If there is some moral principle which says that an action of a certain sort is good, and the more people it benefits, the better, then however many people there are, one's inclined to say, well, it would be better still if it benefited more. That means there is no maximum. There is no maximum. And when there is a moral principle to which there is no maximum, a being is clearly perfectly good, however many or however few of those people are benefited. So God would be perfectly good if he only created. I must avoid the word create because it implies bringing to being out of nothing and so on. The causal relation by which the Father produces Son and Spirit is what has been called an act of essence. That's to say, it's part of his nature. It's not an act of will. He can't choose whether or not to do it. It follows from his nature. And it follows from his nature that he is perfectly good, and therefore that he will make at least one such, or at least two such further persons. But if he were to make a fourth, a fifth, a sixth, those fourth or fifth or sixth would not exist necessarily. They're not as necessarily as God the Father, because God would have satisfied his perfect goodness by making just three. So any other ones wouldn't have to exist. And a being which doesn't exist with as great a necessity as God the Father couldn't be God at all. So necessarily, if there is one divine being, there are three divine beings. So that is my answer to the supposed problem of the Trinity. It only gets made a problem if people don't understand what having an essence is. I don't know about Serbian, but it gets translated into English, are of the same substance. And that's and then the word of gets dropped out. So it said they are the same substance, and that's just a mistranslation.
Great explanation. I believe you can talk more about this topic, but let's get back to our questions. Which arguments would you highlight that reduce the probability of God's existence?
Well, obviously, the argument from evil, from pain and evil doing is the major argument. Some people produce the argument from divine hiddenness, but I don't think that's nearly as strong. Obviously, the existence of suffering, and we all know there is a lot of that in the world. People say, and understandably, how could a perfectly good God allow that? And the first answer is there's a traditional distinction between moral evils and natural evils. moral evils are ones produced by human beings knowingly, um, uh, either deliberately or through negligence. And natural evils are things like droughts and famines and diseases, which humans can't at the moment cure. Now, as regards moral evils, as I said earlier, God gives us a choice of uh, uh, of actions, and if that's to be a real choice of a difference to make to the world, to other people, to ourselves, it has to be a choice between good and evil. If the only choices God gave us were different sorts of good choices, then, as it were, he would have rigged things. He wouldn't have handed the future of the universe in part to us. And it's good that he should. And of course, there is therefore a, an unfortunate consequence of this. Now, you may say, all right, for those who have the choice, but bad for their victims. Someone has the choice of hurting you very badly and chooses to do that, then he is benefited, or rather having the choice. God, in giving him the choice, allows him to make the bad choice, but the sufferer does not have that choice. But the sufferer also has a choice. The sufferer has a choice of how to cope with what's happened to him. And that applies to natural evils as well. When we suffer from disease, we have a choice of how to cope with it. And this is a serious choice. It's a serious choice because each time we make a good choice, that makes it easier to make a good choice next time. And each time we make a bad choice, that makes it easier to make a bad choice next time. Right. So if I get ill, my friends have the choice of neglecting me, not coming and sympathizing, not seeing I have proper medical care, and so on, or of visiting and providing it. They have this choice, and that's good. But I also have the choice of how to cope with the disease. I can be very sorry for myself, and I can be very resentful if I am neglected, and generally I can become very bitter. And that's a choice I make. And it's I can choose to do the opposite. I can choose to be patient, to understand there is a point in my suffering to help me to have a good view of the world, and I can think that my friends, of course, have got other important things to do, and that's not that's why they don't come and see me, and so on. So even if we suffer, we always have choices, and the choices are choices, as I say, that make us. And it's so good that we should be agents of making a difference to ourselves, to other people, and to the world, that for the very short period of our earthly life, and compared to a possible afterlife, and indeed to the universe as a whole, it's a very short period indeed of 80 or 90 or whatever years. And there is therefore a limit to the amount of suffering we endure. We may say it's at the time it seems to us perhaps there isn't a limit, but there is a limit of time, and also a limit of intensity, because if we suffer too much, we just die. So there is a limit, but from the point of view of the sufferer, it seems a rather big limit. But from an outside view, it isn't a very big. It isn't a very big limit. It's a limit. And it's good for us that we should have these choices. And it's good for us that we should be the agent of the sort of person we are to be. And having choices between good and evil, both as agents acting on other people and as victims feeling their actions or the actions of natural causes, we do have these choices and we can make ourselves good people. And that is what God really wants us to do. He wants us to make ourselves and to have the choice of making ourselves. And for that reason, a limited, and it is limited, amount of suffering is not an argument against the existence of God.
A wonderful answer. And can you please mention, are there other arguments against the existence of God?
Well, it's what's called the argument from hiddenness is much discussed these days. This is the argument that if the good God would expect all his creatures to be able to be aware of his presence, to either know him as a result of argument or to feel his presence in their experiencing. And the people who put this argument forward, and it's been put forward in recent years very much by John Schellenberg, say, well, there are plenty of people who don't have an awareness of God, even though they've tried to find out about his existence. And they are not convinced by the arguments. And if God was like a good father, he would want them to be like that. And that's the argument. My argument against it is, well, that would be so if our life was on earth was the only life we have. But of course, by on the Christian tradition and that of many other religions, it isn't. There's a life after death, and if our awareness of God is, for good reason, postponed until then, that's no objection to his existence. And the good reason so often is that it's other people who are able to give us the knowledge of God, and they don't bother to do so.
All right, thank you so much. Now, is there any version of the ontological arguments that you would consider sound?
No, none at all. I expect your readers understand what an ontological argument is. Kant invented the term. It's an argument from pure concepts a priori. That is to say, it doesn't appeal to any evidence at all. It just says it's a logical truth, as true as that all squares have four sides, that God exists. And I don't think that's the case. I don't think there could be a necessary substance, a necessary thing. The ontological argument is committed to the view that the proposition, open quote, necessarily there is a God, close quote, is true. Now, if that is the case, then everything else that is entailed by that is true, such as necessarily there is a powerful person, necessarily there is a good person, and so on. And if that were the case, then it would entail a contradiction to deny any of these propositions. So it would be a contradiction, or it would entail a contradiction, to say it is not the case that there is a powerful person, doesn't entail if it were the case that God is a necessary being, then it would be the case that there is no powerful person, there is no knowing person, that these entail contradictions. But it seems to me a necessary truth that no negative existential proposition ever entails a contradiction. By a negative existential proposition, I mean there are no so-and-sos, objects of a certain kind. There are no apples, there are no trees, there are no human beings, and so on. These are all negative existential propositions. And they never, none of them ever entail a contradiction. It's pretty obvious when you think of it. There are no people. Doesn't seem to entail a contradiction. We can imagine what a universe is like in which there are no people. There are no wise people, we can certainly imagine, or think we can imagine. And no one's ever derived a contradiction from such principles. And so I see no reason to suppose that this one is an exception, because everything that it entails doesn't seem to, the negation of everything it entails doesn't seem to entail a contradiction, which it ought to if it was a necessary proposition. So I think all such arguments are doomed to failure.
Right, good. Some atheists say that the existence of objective morality would increase the likelihood of theism for them. However, why do you think the standard version of the moral argument has no force?
Well, the moral argument is the argument from their being moral truths, not from our knowing them, but from their very existence. For example, that it is wrong for us to torture people, or that it is obligatory for us to keep our just promises and so on. Why people think that these are moral truths is because they think that they've got a concept of morality which has that consequence. And this concept of morality is quite independent of God. But if it were the then it must be in virtue of some property that God has that he is able to do this. For example, omnipotence or perfect goodness or being our creator or something. In which case there is a moral principle that whatever an omnipotent being commands is obligatory, or whatever a perfectly good being commands is obligatory. Now, God can't make that moral principle true because it must be true independent of his will if his will is to make moral truths. So I think there must be at least one moral principle independent of the will of God, and that may be the one I've just stated, that whatever God commands is obligatory. But once you, and that would have to be a necessary truth, because God can't make it the case, and can't see that anything else would make it the case. And if that's a necessary truth, then I think it's very natural to suppose there are plenty of other necessary moral truths other than that one. And I think there are a few. I mean, those few limit what God can do. And God will respect those being perfectly good. For example, that he can't torture us forever or impose suffering for us forever for no good cause or something like that. Um, uh, there are limits to what it would be right for even God to do, and he can see that. Um, so and that is why I think the moral argument has no force. It itself presupposes a necessary truth independent of God's action.
Okay, thank you so much. Now, in your book, you talk about the argument from moral awareness. You said there is no great probability that moral awareness will occur in a godless universe. Can you explain this in a more detail?
Yes, God could have created a universe in which people didn't have a concept of morality. They were just agents who acted for their own good. That seems possible. Indeed, it seems that chimpanzees are a bit like that. They don't have a concept of morality. To have a concept of morality is to believe that certain actions are good or obligatory to do, even when you don't want to do them. And I don't think chimpanzees have that concept, but I do think they have the concept of uh, acting in their own interest. And that suggests that as God could have, as it were, have left creation at that stage. But it is very good for us to have that concept and therefore to choose between good and evil and have the choice of doing good actions because they're good.
Great. What about argument from providence? That's another argument for God in your book. Can you say something more?
Yes, I don't think I would have classified it as a separate argument, except that it does appear so in the first edition of my book, and therefore I wanted to keep the chapter headings the same, and therefore it occurs in the second. But it's really part of the overall argument from us having um, uh, uh, significant choices. Um, But the way it goes is that, well, we could have significant choices, even if there were an infinite number or a large number of us who lived forever. But if we didn't have any death, then there wouldn't be any really significant choices that we could make. Some of our most significant choices affect our own lives and, above all, the lives of others. We have the power to kill people. We have the power to take steps to cure people. And it's the reality of death which forces these choices of great moment upon us. And therefore, death is a providential thing. And uh, in that case, it is good that there should be not merely death, but all the time new people coming along. So a universe would be better if it had birth and death and a limited period between these. And that's the principal thing that I'm drawing attention to. And that we can not merely affect the character of other people, but affect it in a big way and affect our own character in a big way, so that in the end, if we so choose, we can make ourselves really bad people. And if that happens, the way it happens is that we cease to have the concept of good and bad. That is to say, if we're so used to doing an action for our own sake, whether or not it's good or bad, that we lose that concept. Conversely, we have the choice of making ourselves saints, and that is a great choice that we have. So that is what I mean by the argument from providence. Certain particular features of the choices that God gives us um, make them real and important.
Amazing. What can you tell us about the argument from religious experience? Are there any experiences that you would consider extraordinary that would increase the likelihood of God's existence?
I didn't mean by a religious experience one which was extraordinary in the sense of being miraculous, violation of laws. I only meant by it a deep awareness of the presence of God, which may be what some people get when they look at the flowers in springtime or whatever. Um, and they see God's hand, as it were, in that. They see God's creative power in that, and that is a religious experience. Um, and for some people, it's a very acute religious experience. The whole world becomes, as it were, something they see as caused by God. They don't need any argument for it. And or it may be some particular incident in their own lives which somehow comes to life and they see or see God as producing it. Um, and they are just aware of his presence. And that's what I was counting as a religious experience, to be distinguished from miracles, which, of course, some religious experience may be miraculous, but that's not the point of the argument.
All right, there is a similar argument in your book, The Existence of God. You mentioned the argument from history and miracles. What is this argument, and are there any specific events you would argue likely represent God's action in history?
Well, the ones I would point to is the evolution of the Jewish people, which were entirely different from who came to have in the years before Christ quite a totally different concept of God from anything anyone, any other community had in the world. They conceived of him as a moral agent, as a unique and omnipotent moral agent, and no other civilization had that concept. Sometimes said that the Egyptians, or one of the Egyptians' pharaohs, forgotten which one, uh, uh, believed in one God. Well, maybe he did, but he didn't believe in a moral God who was um, concerned with the moral behavior of people. So that would be one. And of course, the incarnation, God coming to earth in Jesus Christ would be another. And it's often argued the conversion of the Western world, not by force, is such an argument. That was used by the medievals quite a bit. I'd also include the Reformation, because although I am not a Protestant, I think it did great good to the Catholic Church and as well by forcing it to get rid of some of its more disreputable practices, such as selling indulgences. Um, um, I would also think the invention of science was a great thing because it gave us greater powers and because it helped us to see uh, the kind of arguments that I have presented for the existence of God. So I think there are many such, and um, one that's often quoted, you may have heard of the Dunkirk wind. Um, um, in the Second World War in 1940, when the Germans invaded France and large numbers of British soldiers were left stranded in France when this happened. And suddenly the weather became very favorable in the sense that the British could send very small boats across the channel to collect them. And if the weather had been normal, then the small boats would not have been able to collect them, and a large number of the British army would have been exterminated. So that's often quoted. I wouldn't cite that necessarily. It might, as a miraculous particular case, but I think there are cases, and I think the first ones I mentioned are of that sort. I don't think miracle. I think there are, of course, as we know, many alleged reports of miracles in the sense of actions which violate the laws of nature, and some of them may be genuine and some of them may not be. But I think there are so many of them that some of them probably are, though for myself, the only one I'm convinced of is the miracle of the resurrection.
Okay, let me add just that pharaoh that you mentioned is Akhenaten or Amenhotep
yes.
IV. Yeah. So what about the Exodus? Most Egyptologists and experts agree that a certain number, maybe several thousand people, of Jewish slaves left Egypt during the time of the Ramses II, one of the most powerful pharaohs, after which they settled in the Canaan and destroyed or occupied several cities. Do you see this as an example of the argument from history and miracles?
Yes, probably. Certainly the Exodus itself. As for the destroying of various peoples, some of the biblical accounts imply that they only destroyed them because they wouldn't let the Israel, Jewish as they came to be called, people pass through their land. But I think there is another reason why they may have had to destroy them, and where, in virtue of which it might be right that they did. The Jews were very conscious of the fact that if you lived in a place where there are all sorts of competing religions, of people worshipping pagan gods, then you are tempted to hedge your bets to worship those gods a bit and worship your God a bit too. And they were desperate to keep their own religion. And they might have felt that the only way to, as it were, do that would be to exterminate a few of the neighboring peoples. Not many of them, just enough to occupy a particular territory all by themselves. And this would be like the action. Suppose you have a pandemic, a very serious pandemic, of which anybody who gets it will die in a deeply painful way. And suppose it is infectious. And suppose certain people refuse to obey the rules to keep themselves separate. They wander about the population. And the only way to stop them might be to kill them. And in that case, it would be necessary to kill them. And the Jews felt that about the peoples whom they exterminated, if they did exterminate them. And one can see that God might have authorized that for that reason. But I don't think that's a particular, but that they kept themselves pure is clearly an event of importance in history, which and God's making it possible for them to keep themselves pure was certainly constitutes an argument from history.
Thank you so much. And what about Jesus Christ? Is there something in his character, ethics, deeds, ideas, or anything beside the resurrection that you mentioned that points to something supreme, extraordinary, or something similar? What do you think?
Yes, very much so. Uh, um, we have to go back a long way for that, and it's really a separate argument. And for reasons of time, I'd rather not discuss that. I have a complicated number of arguments which I put together in a couple of books as to why we should believe that Jesus was God incarnate. And if that's the case, then of course this is an extraordinary event, a historical event of God himself coming to earth and sharing our suffering and providing atonement for our sins. And that is the argument for history.
All right. Do we have time for a cover just argument from music, beauty?
From the existence of music, and the existence, or it can't be the existence of all music, existence of certain sorts of music, and by beautiful music, as it were. It's not a separate argument. It's an argument from the beautiful things that there are in the world, including music and art and nature and so on. Yes, but we have to. But if beauty is to be an argument for God, there has to be objective standards of beauty. There are, to my mind, clearly objective standards of morality. That is to say, it's either true or false that this is morally good action. As to beauty, it is contested, seriously contested, whether there are truths about this painting is beautiful and that one isn't, or whether it's all a matter of taste. I like it and you don't. But assuming that is the case, and I am not convinced about that, then there would be an argument from there being beautiful things. Yes, but if aesthetic criteria are a matter of choice, then the argument can only be from some people have awareness of beauty, and that they have awareness is a good thing, even though it's just a matter of taste. Just as one could have an argument from some food tasting nice, it wouldn't have to be an objective fact that it tastes nice. It would just be that some people enjoy it, and that's a good thing. Likewise, it might just be the case with beautiful objects that is the case.
Right. Dr. Swinburne, do you have any final word? You are almost 90 years old, so do you have any message for our people in Serbia, for those who study this topic about arguing God's existence? Do you have some word to say? And also, are there any other arguments that we didn't cover that you maybe consider sound or valid? So, yeah.
The only words I have to people in Serbia is think about it. Think about it. We owe it to God. We owe it. It must be the case if you find, for example, there's a large sum of money being left in your bank account. You don't know who left it, but you have your suspicions that so-and-so left it. Then you'd better, I mean, if you said, oh, well, that's nice to find a nice sum of money in my bank account, that would be a wrong attitude. You ought to find out, or try to find out, who left it, and to say thank you to them. And that is what I would urge not just the people of Serbia, but everybody to do. We've got life, and it's a very good thing. And we ought to look around for who, if anyone, gave us this, and consider seriously the reasons for supposing that God did. And if we do have these reasons, we need to look around and see whether he has told us a particular way of thanking him. And I think that leads to the Christian religion.
Thank you once again, Professor Svinburn, for sharing your insights with us today. We hope that this discussion has given you new perspectives on the arguments for existence of God. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure to like the video, subscribe to NT Podcast, and leave a comment with your thoughts or questions. We love hearing from you. Don't forget, you can also support the channel by donating through the link in the description. Until next time, stay curious, stay engaged, and we will see in the next episode. Pozdrav iz Srbije.
Okay.